Hello, everyone. As Adam said, I'm Joe Seymour. I'm a transportation planner with VHB based out of Raleigh, North Carolina. I want to appreciate you all allowing me to present. We, as part of this grant, had originally designed 2 public input sessions. We conducted one back in the fall with a series of pop-ups. We'd intended this one to be in person, but because of the COVID-19 public health issues and group meeting restrictions, we're trying to be flexible. And we're extending our public event number 2 to include today with a survey as well as promotion through a workshop in the upcoming few weeks. And so this is intended to give you all an update on the plan, as well as for those that are watching this to be archived online, of some familiarity with the plan and where we're going, as well as a platform for us to seek feedback on the plan so far. So with that, I'm going to walk through kind of what I'd like to do over the next 15 or 20 minutes. First, I want to describe what a pedestrian plan is, what we've heard so far in the planning process, why we're here tonight, how you and the residents of Kinston can help, and then what the next plan steps are for this pedestrian plan update. So in terms of planning, it's a multi-step process, and we're starting at the beginning. So we involve many stakeholders in the pedestrian plan process, and ultimately we're going to get to network recommendations. We're going to help identify what those projects ultimately look like, as well as identify potential funding sources. Now, the next step in the pedestrian plan, once it's out of the hands of this planning process, is then we're going to look towards design. We're going to look at funding. And then finally, we're going to look towards implementation. So what does this look like in the real world? Well, for example, your river walk began as in a pedestrian plan or in a series of other plans well over 15 years ago. Then it went through design, and then it went through construction. So we're starting here at the 3rd iteration of the pedestrian plan, taking a fresh look at what had been mentioned before and then looking forward. So in terms of what is a pedestrian plan, we already talked about this. It's a living document. It's updated every 5 to 10 years. As Adam noted, your original plan was done in 2007. It was updated in 2012, and now we're updating it again in 2020. It represents the vision and goals that's agreed upon by the steering committee, and we get local, regional, and state involvement. So we have local leaders from the county as well as the city. We have representatives from the RPO, as well as involvement from the State Department of Transportation, both from your division as well as from bike ped planners from the state level. Now, what we do here through the pedestrian plan is we identify many projects. We'll probably come out with anywhere from 30 to 50 recommendations across the city, and we're going to rank those and identify some possible funding and an implementation plan for those. And we also include other ways to get people out walking as well to measure success for the pedestrian plan in the city of Kinston. So why are we all here tonight? Well, one, we want to run across our preliminary findings and see if they make sense. Are they heading us in the right direction? Next, I want to share with you the priority corridors, as well as the facility recommendations and the types of improvements, whether they be crosswalks, signals, sidewalks, new greenways, and how they reflect the needs and desires of the residents of Kinston. So there are a number of ingredients that have gone into where we're going to be heading this evening in terms of our network plan or our map for our sidewalks and our crossing improvements and our shared use paths. We looked at the grant application, a number of mapping exercises we did with the community, as well as discussions we'd have with our steering committee. We took guidance from our visions, goals, and objectives, as well as from our massive amount of data collection and from our survey and our public meetings that we conducted in the fall and in the springtime. So from our spring survey, we got a lot of good data to start with. We had over 140 participants in that survey, which is really great turnout compared with the first pedestrian plan. As you can see on the map on your screen from these little turquoise dots here, when we ask people to identify destinations, we got a large clustering of destinations downtown. That makes a lot of sense. But we also had destinations identified all throughout the city, out near the community college and West Vernon Ave, as along Vernon Ave, especially up near the hospital as well as other locations that make sense where people want to walk in Kinston: grocery stores, sports and park areas, shopping centers, healthcare, and other amenities, as well as schools. We also looked at where we're seeing safety issues as well. in terms of pedestrian crashes and how people felt about safety and walking in Kinston. Because when we did ask people about barriers to walking, residents said they don't really care if they have to walk, a longer distance, but safety is a concern. And so that's both vehicular safety, personal safety, as well as potentially like the absence of lighting and so forth. And so we noticed that there were significant overlaps in where we've seen pedestrian crashes over the last 10 years. And where people have pedestrian safety concerns up near the hospital complex as well as downtown. And as you can see from these orange dots, there are other areas where people felt maybe unsafe walking, unsafe crossing the street, Vernon Ave, Highland Ave, Cary Road, as well as some of these other intersections noted here. Now, one thing we did notice is that there are perceptions of safety, and then there are what we've actually seen from pedestrian crashes. And sometimes they overlap and sometimes they don't. And we're taking both of these data sets and using those to help us identify where we should be recommending improvements to the pedestrian network to make it safer and more pleasant to walk in the city. So we take all this data from our surveys, from our public input, as well as from the city's data, and we start creating these priority corridors. So it's purple and yellow. So if you're a fan of Eastern Carolina, these maps are definitely for you. And we identify our primary corridors, which are our spine, if you will, the backbone of the pedestrian network. These connect our main locations where people want to walk to, their grocery stores, their schools, their employers. And then we have our secondary networks in the yellow goldish color here, which are these ribs or their fingers, if you will. They go into the communities, they connect neighborhoods, and they create these recreational loops. So we've got our main corridors and our second corridors. And then we have our priority crossing locations where we anticipate people, either they've indicated they want to cross the road there, or it's a major barrier and we expect people want to cross the road, for example, to reach the baseball stadium, to reach the Holloway Recreational Complex, to reach a school, these types of things. So what we've done is we've shown these priority corridor maps to our steering committee, and we divided the city into three sections, south, north, and west. And we're going to be coming back to these three views of the city for each of our map sets. Now, when we look at the south and downtown section first, some of our main corridors are obviously US 70 down towards the community college, Queen Street, Heritage Street, and then we've got a number of east-west streets, including Caswell, Bright, Blunt, and Washington. And then we have a number of smaller streets that connect the neighborhoods and create these walking loops. For example, Lincoln Street, Tower Hill Road, as well as a potential walking loop or greenway far and off in the future into the southern part of the city. So we'll come back to this, but I'll just want to keep on progressing through. When we look to the north, we have the same pattern of these main primary corridors and then our yellow goldish secondary corridors. We see Hardy Road, Cary Road, North Queen Street, Heritage, and Highland as these main backbones for walking throughout the northern part of the city. And then we see a number of connections to outlying neighborhoods as well as internal neighborhoods off of Rouse Road, Doctors Drive, Heritage up near the high school, West Daniel Street, NC 11 off of MLK, as well as JP Harrison Boulevard, and the area around the Country Club. Again, connecting people out to the main walking corridors and then down north or south to the recreation centers, downtown, parks, schools, you name it. And we look to the western part of the city. One of the things that we have that we don't have in other parts of the city is we have the extension of the Riverwalk, as you can see along the noose here. We also identify Vernon Ave as a primary corridor. Now here, because there is a bit of a gap from US 258, we do show a secondary network extending all the way out to the hotel and the Walmart and the Aldi out in the western part of town. You'll see in a couple minutes, we don't necessarily recommend an extension of a sidewalk all the way out there because there are some challenges, but we do note that there is a desire and there's a connection to get out to that, to the activities and the amenities on that part of the city. So what I'm going to go to next is showing, so now that we have a sense of how our pedestrian network could be built out, I'll show you the types of project improvements that we've been talking about with the steering committee and what we're going to be sharing with the public and how we can build upon this primary and secondary network and what type of projects then would go in the gaps or would replace what we already have on the ground. So there are a number of, I guess, facility types, or it's basically planning jargon and saying these are the types of projects that we could see. So first is a sidewalk, typically 5 feet wide. I know this is the most common pedestrian facility that people are familiar with, and it's intended for neighborhoods, fits in the right of way, and it's fully accessible for people with mobility limitations. The next is a shared use path, sometimes called a multi-use path or a greenway. A great example here is your river walk. And this is typically a facility that's away from the road, usually 10 to 12 feet wide, used for people who are biking, pushing strollers, walking, typically along some sort of amenity, like for example, the river, or along like a higher speed road where you want the distance and you wouldn't feel comfortable walk along the road. Lower cost options often include natural trails or repurposed roadways and so forth, with the opportunity to upgrade in the future. And then there are other types of improvements that aren't necessarily along the roadway, but provide a safety for crossing the roadway. One of these is called a raised crosswalk. It's an even plane that extends from sidewalk to sidewalk, and it's intended on lower speed, lower volume roadways, has a safety benefit, and it forces vehicles to slow down when they're going down the roadway, and it makes pedestrians more visible. There are also speed humps. So these aren't intended to have a crosswalk on top of them, but they are a way of traffic calming and slowing down vehicles going through neighborhoods. The pedestrian plan mostly endorses sidewalks and shared use paths and crossing improvements. We can get into issues of traffic calming. A number of the things that we'll talk about in the plan do have the benefits of slowing down vehicles and making it safer for pedestrians to cross the road and walk along it. But speed humps and so forth aren't a large component of these types of plans. Next is an in-roadway yield sign, sometimes called a paddle sign. These will often go on local roads or lower speed roads. It will put them right in the center of the roadway to let motorists know that they have to yield to pedestrians. And they're compared to other improvements, they're relatively affordable and they can take a lot of abuse because they often get run over and they bounce right back normally. Now that there are types of improvements that you've normally seen at intersections with traffic signals, these are called high visibility crosswalks. They're reflective in low light, sometimes called piano keys. An alternative to a high visibility crosswalk is a standard crosswalk, which is just your 2 parallel bars. Now the difference in where you want to be using these, high visibility crosswalk is typically an intersection where you expect high level pedestrians to cross. So maybe this is down to this is across Heritage to the farmers market, or this is at intersections along Vernon. Whereas standard crosswalks are typically at your 4-way stop intersections, maybe in like the south part of town or northern parts of town, where you don't expect higher vehicle speeds, so forth. Now, there are other crossing improvements that we'll be recommending at locations where you don't have a traffic signal, but you do expect pedestrians to cross, and that may be because your nearest signal is a 1/4 mile in one direction, a 1/4 mile in the other, but we still want to encourage pedestrians to cross the roadway. There are a couple technologies that we can recommend that are proven to reduce pedestrian crashes and get people safely across the road. One of them is called the Rectangular Rapid Flashing Beacon, or the RFB. And this is used on 3 to 4 lane roadways, and they start flashing and they indicate that motorists need to stop and yield to the pedestrian crossing the roadway. A second one is usually used on higher speed roads, and this is called a pedestrian hybrid beacon. There aren't as many of them in the state, but they kind of function like a railroad signal. They're activated by a pedestrian, they wig-wag, alternating red, and then they go to a solid red ball, and that tells motorists that they have to stop, and pedestrians can cross the roadway. All right. So as we're looking ahead, there's another item that we can have to make crossing the roadway easier on these wider roads like Vernon, for example. It's called a pedestrian refuge island. And this is a place for people to cross. They can look one way for crossing the roadway, step into the middle, take a breath, look the other direction, find a safe gap, and then cross the roadway. These are typically in these wide multi-lane roadways where you don't want to be having someone standing in the middle of the road waiting for a gap or standing in the turn lane. Instead, you give them a place that's designated for them and they're able to cross. And this also promotes pedestrian safety and has a proven benefit. And finally, there are other things we can do to improve the visibility of pedestrians when crossing the roadway. Queen Street is a great example of some of these visibility improvements. They're known as, well, one, you've got your high visibility crosswalks on Queen Street, but you've also got improved overhead lighting, as well as curb extensions and signage that puts pedestrians a little farther out so motorists can see them and stop for them, acknowledge them, and allow them to safely cross. And then it's our signalized intersections. This is available at some of the intersections around town, but we'll be making the recommendation for others. Our pedestrian signal heads. These are these countdown signals that you'll often see at your more complex traffic signals. And these also have a safety benefit, and they reduce pedestrian crashes. And finally, one of the recommendations we'll be making as a programmatic element, not so much of a safety improvement, but will be wayfinding and signage routes. This is one of the things we understood from the pedestrian plan survey and from our interviews with stakeholders, is that in addition to making a safer place to walk, we want to give people routes and I guess a pleasant atmosphere by helping put out signage, as well as working with the city to identify, are there routes that we can brainstorm that maybe they're art installations or they're historical notes, or just a fun recreational loop that we can help sign to get people out walking. All right, so with that, I'm going to head into the pedestrian network recommendations. So the lines that you'll see here on these maps that you may have in your advanced packets, but you'll definitely have after today, are primarily sidewalks, which are our pink dashed lines, and our shared use paths are our greenways, identified by our orange bars, and then our intersection improvements indicated by our black outline circles. And just like our priority corridors, we've broken the city up into our three areas again: the south, the north, and the west, just because it's not manageable to look at it from one map. Now, what you'll be seeing in these maps is the existing sidewalk and existing shared use path or greenway, and those are shown as brown lines and yellow lines. One thing to note is that as we're making these recommendations, not every street needs to have a sidewalk. There are many areas where traffic volumes, the number of cars on the street, are low enough, as well as the speeds are low enough that it's more residential in nature, where, and also from a city perspective, financially, it doesn't make sense to put sidewalks everywhere. So what this plan helps the city do is to prioritize where those improvements should be made based on community feedback, need, and safety. And one of the things you'll notice throughout the city is that there's already a pretty good existing network of sidewalks. They may be in varying states of quality, there may be some gaps, but there isn't a lot we have to fill in some sections of the city. So we're focusing on other things like recreational loops, as well as intersections. So when we look at the southern part of the city, a couple notable pedestrian recommendations that will be popping out. If you first look at the top of the page, we're making pedestrian sidewalk recommendations along Tower Hill Road and North Seacrest Street to connect these neighborhoods to both the schools and the recreational center to the south. Recommending sidewalk extension. I know it's not called East Bright Street, but out over towards the bridge over the stream to the recreation center, as well as a sidewalk improvement along Lincoln Street. Also in the southern part of the city, we're recommending or endorsing the shared use path down to the Kinston Music Park that's already been mentioned in previous plans, as well as looking at a greenway loop or a recreational walking loop along some of the existing or previously closed existing closed roads starting at Davis Street, trying to maximize, repurpose some of this land that's not a great use for housing because of the flooding that's been happening, but trying to acknowledge that there's a desire for additional spaces to walk and looking at that. And then finally in the south, one of the things we're recommending is sidewalk improvements along US 70 down towards the community college campus, as well as a crossing improvement in that area. We've seen a number of pedestrian crashes down in the area, and based on both some of the convenience stores and lodging and the school, there is a desire to walk down to that area, that part of the city. And there's also a desire to cross the roadway, and it's a pretty wide roadway, and we've had some safety issues there as well. All right, when we look to the north, we have a number of sidewalk infill projects, and this is based on just the pattern of development. Whereas in the southern part of the city, we have a closer, more established grid of sidewalks. In the north, not so much. So here we're making sidewalk recommendations along Highland Ave, filling in that gap, as well as along MLK and NC11, extension of sidewalk along North Queen Street, as well as the gaps at Plaza Boulevard, North Heritage, Doctors Drive, Cary Road, Rouse Road, and Hardy Road. We're also recommending some sidewalk infill around the Country Club to complete an internal walking loop, as well as a continuation of sidewalk along Cary Road to bring us down to Vernon Ave. And again, what we see in the north here is focus on infill of sidewalks in areas where we have a lot of housing, but we don't have a lot of sidewalk infrastructure. And so we're trying to identify these routes that bring people down to parks, down to employment, down to location for errands, and have a safe facility for them to walk along. There are also a number of intersection improvements here that we've identified based on crash histories along Highland Ave, along North Queen Street, along North Heritage, up near the medical complexes there, and a number along Vernon Ave, which we'll get to in a moment. All right, the final kind of map or segment is the western area of Kinston. And here, Vernon Ave is one of the focal points of the pedestrian plan. And this was same in the previous plans in terms of where pedestrian crashes are happening, as well as bicycle crashes. It's along Vernon Ave. There's some sidewalk, but what we'd be recommending is infill along this corridor, as well as pedestrian crossing improvements at Hardy, Greenbrier, Cary, and College Street, as well as just north of the Kinston Community Center and the aquatic facility. There may be some existing traffic signals here, and some locations there may not be a traffic signal, and there are types of improvements that we can recommend in terms of pedestrian signal heads, as well as some improvements in lighting and pavement markings that would make it safer to cross the roadway. We're also recommending an extension of the Riverwalk, as been mentioned in the previous plans, out to the water park and the community center. And we're also recommending a portion of sidewalk between US 258 and US 70 and Hill Farm Road. There have been a number of, as well as 2 intersection improvement projects here to reflect the need to walk between these locations, as well as across the roadway. So where we're going next with this is we're going to be, in addition to anticipate some discussion today, but also looking ahead, we're going to be asking the community for feedback on this draft network. So we're opening the survey today. It's going to be open through mid-November, and the survey asks for preferences from community members on what type of facilities they want to see along these roadways, as well as at specific intersections. And we have it online at tinyurl.com/KinstonWalks. And we'll also be working with Sarah and Adam in the planning department to distribute paper copies of this survey across the city for those that may not have internet access. That'll be at locations to be determined, depending on their availability and their openness, given city restrictions. And an important thing to note is that these results, just like the previous survey from the spring, will help us update the plan and turn it around for improvements in winter of 2020 and 2021. All right, the final element of the plan is programmatic initiatives. So whereas the number of things I went over are looking at some of the infrastructure that we can recommend, we're also going to be identifying the types of things that can overcome the barriers that were identified by the steering committee and during the survey to get people out walking, walking more, visiting local businesses, getting out and exercising, and just having a pleasant time. We'll be identifying a number of encouragement programs, walking tours, and opportunities for wayfinding. We're also going to be recommending how the city can take advantage of existing education programs through NCDOT and nonprofit partners. We'll also be recommending participation in certain enforcement programs, one being Watch from ENC. And we'll also be recommending certain evaluation programs as well that the city can stop and take stock of where they are and proceed forward. And this will include walking audits, road safety audits, or road safety assessments, as well as maybe renewing a community survey and doing counts. All right, so where are we going from here? We've been active since November of 2019, and we're slowed down by COVID a little bit. But so far, we've been through our existing conditions, our public workshop number 1, and this is kicking off kind of our month-long public workshop and outreach number 2. Once we get the public feedback over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be coming back to the steering committee in winter of 2020, potentially early 2021, with a draft plan, getting their feedback, and then we'll be turning around a final plan that'll likely be brought before the City Council for consideration and adoption. And that brings me to the end. And so here are my collaborators, Adam and Sarah. Thank you so much for helping with the steering committee, helping move this project forward. Also have Catherine at NCDOT, as well as a new teammate named Tony from NCDOT is going to be helping as well.